The story grabs attention immediately through a contrast of brutal weather and human vulnerability. It starts with Reggie, a relatable, hardworking character operating in a harsh industrial environment. This establishes immediate empathy and grit. The hook is the discovery of the soaking wet, shivering child hiding behind a dumpster in the pouring rain. The tension increases when the child, Diana, reveals a profound, fearful vulnerability, holding a ragged stuffed rabbit as her only comfort. The introduction grabs attention by forcing the reader to wonder, why is a young girl alone in such a dangerous place? What happened to her? And how will a woman just trying to survive handle this high-stakes situation? The industrial district remained drenched, the rain turning the alleyway into a slick, treacherous path. Reggie pressed her utilitarian jumpsuit against the chill, her hands gentle but firm on the girl's shoulders, shielding her from the biting wind. The child, barely 6, was trembling so violently that her teeth chattered, a sound that pierced through the roar of the downpour. She clutched a ragged, rain-soaked stuffed rabbit to her chest with a desperate grip, her knuckle white. Reggie didn't hesitate. She knew she couldn't leave her there. "It's okay, little one," Reggie murmured, her voice steady despite the fear hammering in her own chest. "You're safe with me." She wrapped her heavy-duty work jacket around the girl, lifting her into her arms. The child was shockingly light, a small bundle of terror and cold. Reggie's apartment was a stark contrast to the storm outside, though not much warmer. It was a cramped studio on the 3rd floor of a crumbling brick building, smells of damp drywall mixing with the faint scent of stale coffee. She set the girl down on the threadbare rug near the small electric heater. The child shrank back against the wall, her long black hair soaked and sticking to her forehead, her eyes wide and haunted. She held onto that ragged rabbit like it was a shield against the world. Reggie didn't push. Instead, she went to her small kitchenette. The cupboards were nearly bare, but she managed to find a half loaf of bread and some cheese. She quickly made a grilled cheese sandwich, the comforting smell filling the small room, and poured a glass of warm milk. When she returned to the rug, she placed the plate gently on the floor between them. "I'm Reggie," she said softly, sitting cross-legged a few feet away. The girl didn't speak. She looked from the food to Reggie, her fear slowly warring with hunger. Finally, she took a hesitant bite, then another, eating quickly as if someone might take it away. While the girl ate, Reggie quietly fetched a dry towel and began to gently pat the girl's hair, treating the soaked, oversized jacket with care. When the plate was empty, the child looked at her for the first time without pure terror. "Diana," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My name is Diana." Reggie felt a wave of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by a dark suspicion. A child like this, wearing expensive clothes under that heavy parka, didn't belong in that alley. "Where are your parents, Diana?" Reggie asked, keeping her voice light. The child's face immediately clouded over, a look of profound fear replacing the hunger. She clutched the rabbit tighter. "Bad men," Diana whispered, shivering again though the heater was on high. "They want to take me away. Daddy said to hide." She looked around the small apartment, as if expecting someone to burst through the door. Reggie understood then. She had brought a secret into her home, one that smelled of danger. But looking at the vulnerable child, she knew she couldn't turn her back. The morning light was gray and unforgiving, matching the churning anxiety in Reggie's stomach. Diana had slept fitfully on the small sofa, clutching the ragged rabbit, but now she was awake, watching Reggie with wide, anxious eyes as she prepared a simple breakfast of oatmeal. Reggie knew she couldn't keep the girl. The child deserved safety, not a cramped studio apartment in a dangerous neighborhood. After a quiet breakfast, Reggie bundled Diana back into the oversized, rain-soaked parka and carried her down to her rusted, compact car. Diana didn't say a word, just stared out the window, her small hand firmly gripping the rabbit, a silhouette of fear against the bleak city landscape. Reggie followed the vague directions Diana had whispered, driving away from the industrial district and toward the affluent, gated community on the other side of the city, a place Reggie had only ever seen from a distance. As they approached the address, the city's harshness vanished, replaced by manicured lawns and towering oak trees. Yet, the opulence felt suffocating. At the end of a long private drive stood a massive fortress-like mansion, its iron gates imposing and intricately designed. Two muscular men in sharp dark suits stood guard, their eyes scanning the area with professional intensity. Reggie's heart hammered against her ribs as she slowed the car, the weight of what she was doing. Returning a child to a place that felt more like a prison than a home, settling heavily on her shoulders. The guards signaled for her to stop, their presence radiating a cold, calculated danger that made Reggie's utilitarian jumpsuit feel utterly out of place. Diana shrank lower in her seat, her knuckles turning white around the stuffed toy. Before Reggie could even roll down her window, a sleek black sedan pulled up smoothly beside her car, its headlights cutting through the morning haze. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was impeccably dressed in a dark, structured suit, his hair slicked back, his expression stern and unreadable. He exuded an aura of absolute power and menace, a man accustomed to commanding fear. This was Choi Min-Jae. He didn't look at Reggie. His intense gaze was fixed entirely on the small figure in the passenger seat. Reggie felt a wave of terror, realizing immediately that this man was far more dangerous than any street thug she had ever encountered. Choi moved toward the car, his movements precise and purposeful, leaving Reggie trapped between her desire to protect the child and the overwhelming reality of the dangerous world she had just stepped into. Choi Min-Jae's gaze finally shifted from his daughter to Reggie, his eyes cold and assessing, instantly analyzing her utilitarian jumpsuit and the rusted car she had arrived in. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of his authority, while the armed guard stood motionless nearby. Diana, still clutching her ragged stuffed rabbit, slowly moved from her seat to stand beside Reggie, her small hand creeping into Reggie's heavy work uniform. It was a gesture of trust that visibly halted Choi's breath, his stern expression flickering with a hint of genuine shock. He had never seen his terrified, silent daughter bond with anyone so quickly. He looked at the stark contrast between them. His daughter, usually encased in fear, now finding solace in a woman who was clearly struggling to get by. "You have courage, Miss Cobert," Choi said, his voice low, commanding and heavily accented, yet remarkably calm. He ignored the guards and stepped closer, his presence immense. "Diana has not spoken to anyone outside this house in months." He looked down at his daughter, then back to Reggie, a calculating look replacing his surprise. "She trusts you." The implication was clear. Reggie had brought something into this fortress that money could not buy. Choi didn't offer a traditional thank you. Instead, he offered a proposition that shattered the quiet morning. He needed someone Diana trusted, someone who wasn't part of the corrupt, dangerous world he inhabited. "I offer you a position," Choi continued, his tone turning clinical and commanding. "Stay. Be my daughter's companion. I will pay you 10 times what you make in that industrial district." Reggie was stunned, her mind racing from the shock of the offer to the terrifying reality of the man making it. She knew what he was. The rumors of the cartel leader's ruthlessness were legendary. Yet, as she looked at Diana, who was now hugging Reggie's leg, she felt a profound tug of compassion. "However," Choi added, his voice turning deadly serious, "you must understand the cost. If you enter my world, you are no longer just a waitress. You become a target for my enemies. There is no leaving this life once you choose it." Reggie looked into his uncompromising eyes, knowing that accepting this offer meant abandoning her safety for a life of luxury built on a foundation of terror, all to protect the innocent child who had found her in the rain. Reggie stood in the center of a bedroom larger than her entire apartment, the plush velvet curtains blocking out the afternoon sun and creating a suffocating twilight. Her utilitarian jumpsuit felt absurdly out of place among the mahogany furniture and silk sheets. The transition was jarring. One day she was scrubbing greasy pans, and the next, she was surrounded by wealth that smelled faintly of blood and iron. Diana, however, seemed to thrive, her fear receding as she ran her small hands over the luxurious fabrics, clutching her ragged rabbit as a familiar anchor in this alien landscape. The mansion was a gilded cage, beautiful yet terrifyingly oppressive. Armed men in dark suits moved silently through the hallways, their eyes ever watchful, turning every corridor into a potential confrontation. Reggie felt their gaze constantly, a silent reminder that she was a guest in a fortress, not a resident of a home. Navigating this new life was an exercise in extreme tension. At dinner, Reggie sat at a long, imposing table while Choi Min-Jae ate in cold silence, the only sound the clinking of expensive cutlery. The mansion was filled with luxurious amenities, a private theater, a sprawling library, a crystal-clear indoor pool. Yet the atmosphere was devoid of warmth. Reggie spent her days ensuring Diana felt safe, filling the silent rooms with chatter and laughter, trying to bring a normalcy that Choi seemed incapable of providing. The staff was polite but distant, treating her with a wary respect, knowing her position was precarious. Every time she looked out a window, she saw a guard patrolling the grounds, reminding her of Choi's warning. She was now a target, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. Despite the fear, a strange comfort began to form in the quiet moments. She found that Diana loved to draw, sketching scenes of a bright, simple house with flowers, a stark contrast to the dark fortress she lived in. Reggie would sit with her for hours, encouraging the creativity that Choi deemed unimportant. She was learning to balance the fear with the profound need to protect the child. She was also learning the subtle shifts in Choi's demeanor. A tightening of his jaw when a guard approached, a softening of his eyes when he watched Diana interact with her. It was a life lived entirely in the shadows, where luxury was merely a cover for danger, and where Reggie had to constantly navigate the fine line between being a protector and becoming collateral damage. The tension in the mansion was stifling, a constant, heavy pressure that seemed to squeeze the air from Reggie's lungs. Yet it was the silence between Choi and his daughter that felt most dangerous. Days turned into a week, and while Reggie worked tirelessly to create a veneer of normalcy, Choi remained a ghost in his own home, watching from the periphery with cold, detached eyes. One evening, after a particularly silent dinner where Diana had struggled to engage her father in conversation, Reggie finally reached her breaking point. As Choi began to retreat to his study, closing the door on the world, and on his daughter, Reggie followed him, her heart hammering against her ribs, her voice shaking but resolute. "You can't keep doing this, Choi," she said, her voice echoing in the vast, shadowed room. He paused, his back to her, his posture rigid and forbidding, the silent threat of his power filling the space between them. Choi turned slowly, his face a mask of indifference, his dark eyes intense and impenetrable. He seemed surprised that anyone would dare challenge him, especially a woman he hired as a companion. "You know nothing of my world, Reggie," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Distance is not neglect. It is protection. My enemies would use her to destroy me." Reggie didn't back down, fueled by the memory of Diana's fearful whispers in the rain, and the lonely way she clutched her stuffed rabbit. She stepped into his space, her own fear warring with a fierce protective instinct. "Protection? She's living in a fortress, Choi, but she's starved for love," Reggie argued, her voice rising with passion. "You're so focused on the threats outside that you're creating a prison inside. She doesn't need a bodyguard, she needs a father." The silence that followed was suffocating, the air thick with the weight of her words and the dangerous truth they contained. Choi stared at her, his expression unreadable, a muscle tightening in his jaw as he processed her challenge. He was a man accustomed to absolute obedience, yet Reggie was offering him something different. Honesty born of compassion. For a moment, the menacing cartel leader seemed to falter, the mask of cold ruthlessness cracking to reveal the lonely man beneath. He looked toward the door, perhaps imagining his daughter sleeping alone in the vast mansion, surrounded by guards but devoid of warmth. Reggie knew she had crossed a line, but as she stood her ground, she felt a glimmer of hope that she had forced him to look past his paranoia and see the real danger, losing his daughter's heart. The heavy silence that had once defined the mansion began to erode, replaced by the soft sounds of Diana's laughter, a sound that seemed to visibly unsettle, and yet move Choi Min-Jae. Following Reggie's confrontation, the cartel leader didn't immediately turn into a doting father, but he began to spend time in the main living areas rather than retreating to his study. He would sit in a plush armchair, ostensibly working on his tablet, but his intense gaze would inevitably drift toward Reggie and Diana as they worked on puzzles or drew pictures on the floor. Reggie noticed the subtle changes. The tightening of his jaw softened when Diana showed him a drawing, and he would sometimes pause his work to listen to the stories Reggie read aloud. The boundary between Reggie as a hired employee and a trusted confidant was blurring, and the air between her and Choi became charged with an unspoken tension that was both terrifying and intoxicating. One evening after Diana had fallen asleep, Reggie found Choi standing on the terrace overlooking the expansive, guarded gardens. The night air was crisp, and the mansion felt quiet, almost peaceful in the darkness. She had gone to bring him a cup of tea, a habit she had quietly established, and found him looking out at the perimeter, his expression uncharacteristically contemplative. He turned as she approached, taking the cup from her hand, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second, sending a jolt of electricity through her. "You have brought life back into this place, Reggie," he murmured, his voice low and intimate, a stark contrast to his usual commanding tone. "For a long time I thought only of security. I forgot that life is meant to be lived, not just defended." The moment was fragile, suspended between the brutal reality of his world and the domestic warmth Reggie was trying to cultivate. She felt the depth of his loneliness, the immense burden he carried, and it was hard not to feel a profound empathy for the man behind the menace. But she also knew that this bond was a trap. The closer she got to him, the deeper she was drawn into the violent world he sought to protect her from. He looked at her then, not as an employee, but with a raw vulnerability that terrified her more than his anger ever could. She was falling for him, and in doing so she was risking everything, her safety, her morality, and perhaps her life, by allowing herself to become fully entangled in the dangerous, alluring life of the cartel leader. The fragile peace inside the mansion shattered on a rainy Thursday night, the sudden blare of security alarms cutting through the calm like a knife. Reggie was in the living room with Diana, trying to coax the girl into finishing a drawing, when the main lights plunged the room into darkness, replaced instantly by the eerie crimson glow of emergency lighting. Within seconds the heavy mahogany doors burst open, and Choi Min-Jae rushed in, his face tight with the lethal focus Reggie had only seen once before. He didn't speak. He simply grabbed Reggie's arm with one hand and Diana with the other, hauling them toward the hidden passageway behind the library bookshelves. The distant sound of gunfire echoed through the reinforced walls, a terrifying confirmation that the compound had been breached. Reggie's heart hammered against her ribs, the comfort of the last few weeks vanishing instantly, replaced by a cold, sharp terror. They scrambled through the narrow, concrete tunnel, the sound of the fighting growing fainter behind them but the threat escalating ahead. Choi moved with terrifying efficiency, his gun drawn, checking corners with practiced movements that underscored the danger he had warned her about. Diana was silent, her small hand clutching Reggie's with desperate strength. Her ragged rabbit nearly dropped in the panic. They emerged into the underground garage, where a armored SUV awaited, its engine idling with a low rumble. Choi shoved them into the rear seat, diving into the driver's side as the garage doors began to lift. The drive was a blur of high-speed maneuvers through the slick, rain-drenched streets, Choi scanning for tails while Reggie shielded Diana from the chaotic movement, her mind racing with the realization that their quiet life was over. Hours later they reached a secluded cabin tucked deep within the mountains, a place starkly different from the opulent mansion they had fled. It was a rustic, small structure surrounded by dense pine trees, far from the watchful eyes of the city. Choi quickly secured the perimeter, his movements precise, while Reggie tried to calm a shivering Diana, who was now weeping softly. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving Reggie exhausted and terrified, realizing that the forbidden feelings she had nurtured were now directly tied to a war that could destroy them all. She watched Choi standing by the window, gun in hand, watching the darkness, and knew that the cartel leader was finally forced to face the consequence of his life. His enemies had finally found the only thing he truly cared about. The seclusion of the mountain cabin offered no protection against the ruthlessness of the rival faction. The eerie quiet of the pines was broken not by wind, but by the sharp, splintering crack of wood as bullets riddled the front door. Reggie was jolted from a light sleep by the sound, instantly recognizing the deadly intent behind it. She threw herself off the narrow bed, scrambling toward Diana, who was already screaming in terror, clutching the ragged rabbit so tightly it seemed part of her. "Stay down, Diana. Under the bed now," Reggie commanded, her voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. She shoved the child into the small space beneath the mattress, using her own body to shield the opening as the cabin became a target range. Choi was already in motion, a grim silhouette against the moonlight filtering through the broken windows. He returned fire with lethal precision, his face a mask of cold concentration, defending his family with the ferocity of a cornered beast. Reggie could hear the attackers shouting outside, their voices harsh and demanding, moving closer to the cabin's fragile walls. A bullet shattered the lamp beside Reggie, showering her with glass, but she didn't flinch. Her focus was entirely on Diana, who was hyperventilating in the darkness. Reggie knew she had to keep the child calm and quiet, or they would be discovered. She crawled under the bed herself, pulling Diana into a tight embrace, whispering soothing words that were barely audible over the roar of gunfire. The danger escalated when a smoke grenade was tossed through a window, filling the cabin with a thick, choking haze. Reggie began to cough, her eyes stinging, but she kept her arms wrapped around Diana. Through the smoke, she heard the front door groan under the weight of a forced entry. Choi was out of ammunition for his primary weapon and drew a knife, bracing for a hand-to-hand fight. Reggie saw a figure looming in the smoke near the bed. Ignoring the peril to herself, she grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the small kitchenette counter nearby and struck the intruder, desperate to buy Choi time. She was terrified, fully aware that she was utterly outmatched in this violent world. Yet the fierce love for the child in her arms gave her a strength she never knew she possessed, turning a struggling worker into a desperate defender. The smoky adrenaline of the fight had faded, replaced by a cold, heavy silence in the mountain cabin that felt heavier than the gunshots. Choi Min-Jae sat at the rustic wooden table, cleaning his knife with a calm, methodical intensity that belied the turmoil within him. Beside him, Reggie sat with Diana, holding the child close, the ragged rabbit sitting limp between them. The terror of the ambush had passed, but its mark was permanent. Choi looked at the tiny bandage on his daughter's arm. A grazing wound from a splintered shard of wood, and felt a suffocating pressure in his chest. He had spent his life building a fortress of fear, believing it was the only shield against the world. Yet, it was that very fortress that had turned his daughter into a target, turning his life's work into a death sentence for the only person he truly loved. The ruthless cartel leader was dying, crushed under the weight of his own violent legacy. He looked at Reggie, seeing not just the woman who had brought warmth back into his cold life, but the woman who had risked her own to protect Diana. She was terrified, yet she was holding the child together, defying the brutal world he had brought them into. The contrast between Reggie's genuine compassion and his own violent paranoia was stark and unforgiving. He realized with a clarity that was almost physical, if he continued this path, he would lose them. The cartel didn't offer retirement. It offered death or imprisonment. He took a deep breath, the decision settling into his bones not as a choice, but as a necessity. He would use every dollar, every connection, every ounce of power he had built through crime to buy a future free from it. "It ends today," Choi said, his voice quiet but carrying an absolute, undeniable authority that broke the silence. He stood up, towering in the small cabin, his expression resolute. He was done being a target, done putting a bullseye on his daughter's back. He would systematically dismantle his criminal empire, leverage his fortune into legitimate businesses, and sever the bloody ties that bound him to the underworld. It would be dangerous, perhaps even suicidal, but it was the only way to ensure Diana had a life, not just a survival. He walked over to the window, looking out into the dense pine trees, no longer watching for enemies, but dreaming of a future where his daughter could play in the sun without fear. Reggie watched him, seeing the terrifying, brilliant man she had fallen for begin the slow, arduous process of redemption, knowing that the journey had just begun. The violent storm that had once surrounded them had finally passed, leaving behind a fragile but profound tranquility. The mansion, formerly a fortified prison of fear, underwent a subtle yet undeniable transformation. Heavy, dark curtains were replaced with sheer fabrics that allowed sunlight to pour into the rooms, illuminating corners once shrouded in shadows. Reggie brought warmth into every space, her presence acting as a gentle antidote to the coldness that had previously defined Choi Min-Jae's life. The armed guard still patrolled the perimeter, a necessary precaution for a man stepping away from the criminal underworld, but they no longer stood inside the house. Diana blossomed in this new environment, her haunted eyes replaced with a vibrant curiosity. She spent her days in the sprawling library or running through the gardens, no longer clutching her ragged rabbit in fear, but carrying it as a cherished toy. The ceremony was small, intimate, and held in the mansion's garden, surrounded only by a few loyal staff members and the quiet beauty of nature. Reggie wore a simple, elegant white dress, looking utterly out of place yet completely at home beside Choi, who was dressed in a suit that seemed less like armor and more like clothing. When they exchanged vows, the air was thick not with menace, but with a profound, quiet hope. Choi looked at Reggie not with the calculating gaze of a cartel leader, but with the raw vulnerability of a man who had finally found the anchor he didn't know he was looking for. Diana stood between them, holding Reggie's hand, her smile radiant and genuine. It was a merging of two worlds, the desperate, gritty survival of Reggie's past, and the opulent, dangerous luxury of Choi's, finally anchored by the simple, powerful act of love. In the months that followed, the compound became a true home. Reggie utilized the mansion's vast resources to establish a foundation dedicated to protecting children in the industrial district, a testament to her journey from the alleyway to this life of privilege. Choi focused on legitimate business ventures, his ruthless intelligence now directed toward building a future, rather than securing a violent present. The mansion no longer echoed with silent fear. It was filled with the sounds of a family learning to live without looking over their shoulders. Diana started attending a private school, her days filled with friendship and learning, her nightmares a distant memory. Sitting on the terrace at sunset, watching Choi play with Diana in the garden, Reggie felt a deep sense of peace. She had gone from feeding a shivering child in the rain to creating a harbor of safety, proving that even in the coldest shadows, love could find a way to forge a new, beautiful beginning.